Is your front suspension crossmember on your MGB covered in dirt and oil? Is it rusted beyond compare? Do you want to understand how you can make it look like this? Stick around and find out all the steps that were taken to refurbish this front suspension crossmember on a 1972 MGB. Hey, it's Studio Steve, and welcome to another episode of Maggie's Makeover. For those of you who are new to the channel, we're trying to find out if my 1972 MGB that hasn't run in over 40 years can be restored to its former glory. For those of you who are following along in this journey, you'll note that in our last episode, Mechanic Steve did a skillful job of tearing down Maggie's whole front suspension and steering components. In the next episodes, Mechanic Steve is planning to put all of that back together on Maggie, but first, he has to refurbish some of those components. So let's head down to the garage and see what his thoughts are on the first component, which is the front suspension crossmember. Hey, thanks Studio Steve, and welcome back to the garage, everybody. You know, now that Maggie's front suspension is completely disassembled, now is the time to look at all of those parts and determine, are we going to refurbish them, and if so, how, or are we going to replace them? And a lot of that will have to do with the constraints of time, cost, and availability. The first major part is this front suspension cross frame. Last time I checked, nobody's manufacturing these, so this is definitely a part that's going to be refurbished. You can see right now I still have the pivot bolts on these, some of the old bushings on the bump stops, all of that has to be replaced. It's a grimy, dirty, oily mess. And so the first thing that has to be done to this is it's got to be cleaned. Now you'll notice when I turn this over and maybe even point it sideways, it's a hollow member. And so in between the front and the top surfaces are cavities inside of this. And so my thought is probably send this out, have it sandblasted. Okay, everybody, I have just completely removed the remaining parts that are on the suspension crossmember. And guess what? I forgot to turn the camera on. You know, sometimes that happens in the world of film. So let me just take you through what I did. The first thing were the pivot bolts. These are 9/16 nuts and bolts. I think the bolt heads are on the inside, they're reversed, and the nuts are on the outside. So those were taken off. You got to kind of hold them from the other side. While I have you here in this place, this orientation, these are the spigots. These sort of orient the coil as they sit in the crossmember as they mate with it. These were two 7/16 nuts and bolts. And then, let me rotate this for you. We took off the bump stops. These bump stops with these spacers kind of go like this. And so there's two bolts and nuts up here, two nuts and bolts down there. I believe it's the shorter ones on top, the longer ones are on the bottom. So didn't miss much, but that's what we did. And so now the next step is to degrease the front suspension crossmember. The sandblaster that I talked to was adamant about me doing that in preparing it for sandblasting, or else he said if I brought it to him kind of like this, he was gonna double the cost to get the job done, and we don't want that. So that's the next step. We'll take care of that now. Here's a view of the top of the front suspension crossmember, and you can see that there's been oil that's been leaked on it and then dirt that's caked on top of that. Some areas of rust are observable as well, and on the driver's side, it looks like there's an area where oil leaked out of the rack in comparison to the passenger side. The bottom of the front suspension crossmember is similar to the top. You can see that the surfaces are covered in oil.
Gladly, there's not any structural damage to the unit. Even if you take a look, there's a few cobwebs. There's the bushings, but you can see some rust that's been built up on this unit that's going to need to be cleaned up and repainted. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this plastic scraper, scrape off as much of the dirt and grime as we can. We're then going to use some PB Blaster engine degreaser, let that sit for a little while, and then we've got a couple of metal brushes where we're going to scrub the hell out of this thing. So with that, let's dig in and start the process of cleaning this up. Given that this was going to be a pretty messy activity, I decided to do it over a gravel area. Furthermore, to catch any of the contaminants or chemicals coming off of the front suspension crossmember as a result of the cleaning process, I placed a number of plastic sheets. You can see one down on top of the gravel and then another one on top of the two sawhorses that supported the front suspension crossmember. Now, as you can see here, this video is in 6 times the speed. It's just a matter of painstakingly scrubbing off all of the grime and all the nooks and the crannies of the surfaces of the front suspension crossmember, not only on the top but also on the bottom. I decided to do this first before degreasing the front suspension crossmember because I felt if I got as much of this grime off in the beginning prior to putting the degreaser on, I'd end up with a cleaner part after the process. And it's also important to do the inside cavities of the front suspension crossmember. And in the areas where I couldn't use the plastic scraper, I actually used some emery cloth to kind of sand those areas to get all of the gunk off of it. Given that I'm a pretty thorough person in anything that I do in my life, I decided to scrape down the front suspension crossmember with wire brushes prior to the application of the degreaser. The thought being here that perhaps I could loosen up any of the rust that was on the front suspension crossmember that I couldn't get with the plastic scraper. Again, this is 6 times the normal speed, and you can see it's just a painstaking process to scrub the entire front suspension crossmember down. This was done not only on the top of the front suspension crossmember, but also on the bottom and then also in the internal cavities using a smaller size brush for those areas that were pretty confined. Next came the application of the degreaser. And I guess if you take a look at this, you'll see there's a lot of misting that's coming off of the application of this. And I'll just say from the beginning here, I probably should have had some eye protection on. You definitely don't want to get this stuff in your eye. You can see I'm pretty close to the front suspension cross frame and within that mist area. So those of you who are going to do this, I would suggest you use eye protection. So no secret here, you got to get in all of the nooks and crannies, both on the top and the bottom of the front suspension cross frame. And when you think you've covered it, well, you got to go over it again and make sure that you apply it and just be thorough in the application of it. You don't want to miss areas, go through this whole process and miss it. You can see here I'm actually trying to get on the inside, the internal cavities through these holes on the front suspension crossmember and then down on either of the sides. You know, the best case scenario, you know, I decided to pick this up and try to shoot it down into the front suspension crossmember on both sides. Again, just trying to be very, very thorough with the process and not missing any of the steps. And just to be thorough one last time, I decided to run over it with the metal brushes one more time. Again, you don't want to go through the trouble of going doing all of this and then find out that you missed some of those spots. So attention to detail and just time-consuming process, but do the best that you can do and be thorough in the process. And so after allowing the degreaser to soak for an hour or two, it was time to power wash it off. And I gotta tell you, if I thought I needed safety goggles when I applied the degreaser, I sure needed them when I power washed this. You can see water is just going everywhere. I didn't have a pair of safety goggles on, and I probably should have. If you're gonna do this job, please wear a pair. And so it's really just spraying the entire suspension cross member down on the outside, on the top and the bottom, and then really getting inside those cavities so that you make sure that you get all of that degreaser off, and any of the grime that was left on the front suspension cross member, hopefully that comes off with it. Another way to actually ensure this is to, again, tip the front suspension cross member on up on one of its sides and spray down into the cavity, and then to flip it on the other side and spray down into the cavity as well, making sure that we get everything, all of the degreaser, all of the crud off of the front suspension cross member. Here's a look at the top of the front suspension cross member after the degreasing process. You can see that the use of the plastic scraper along with the degreaser removed the oil and the caked on dirt that was there previously. The use of the metal brushes also removed any of the flaky rust that was on the front suspension cross member as well. If we flip the front suspension cross member over, you'll see that the bottom surfaces pretty much came out as the top did. Although you can't really see the internal cavities in this view, they pretty much came out the same. And therefore, the front suspension cross member is now ready to be sent to the sandblaster and to be painted. When looking for a local company to refurbish the front suspension cross member, I came across a business by the name of Skyline Coatings. Although they sandblast, prime, paint, and powder coat industrial components, a large portion of their work is focused in the automotive market. Skyline Coatings is located about 45 minutes northwest of Boston, Massachusetts, in a town called Chelmsford. Oddly, that's the town that I grew up in and where Maggie was stored for 25 years out of her 42-year hibernation. I took a ride to Skyline Coatings and met with Robbie Nguyen, the principal owner of the company. Robbie did a great job of showing me not only the equipment, but discussing the different restoration capabilities that his business focused on.
This is Skyline Coatings. It's an industrial and painting and powder coating shop. We have a sandblaster. So if you have old parts that's already rusted or anything like that, we can strip all that off, start from scratch, make it new to any custom color that you want to do. This is the spray booth that we have here. Does all the wet paint. We do our powder coating in here as well. This is our air compressor. It's pretty much the driving force of everything. All the paint, the paint pot uses air, the powder coating machine uses air. Very essential to the business and to any type of powder coating or painting shop. This is what's going to cure and bake your goods.
After a thorough discussion which included the variables of our ability to coat not only the outside of the front suspension cross member, but also all of the internal cavities, along with the durability of the coating and its cost, I elected to finish the front suspension cross member using a two-part epoxy paint from Sherwin-Williams in a satin black finish. Prior to sandblasting, Maggie's front suspension cross member was soaked in a high-temperature liquid alkaline solution for the final degreasing and rust removal. After sandblasting and a final cleaning, several coats of the Sherwin-Williams two-part epoxy primer were applied to the front suspension cross member, including all of the internal cavities. After the part was heat cycled in an oven to cure the epoxy primer, several coats of the satin black two-part epoxy paint were sprayed on the front suspension crossmember, including the internal cavities. The part was then placed in the oven and heat cycled one more time to cure the final coat of paint to conclude the restoration process. So that's a wrap for this episode of Maggie's Makeover. For those of you who have actually refurbished your front suspension crossmember, leave us a comment. Let Maggie's fans know how you chose to refurbish it and how it actually turned out. In our next episode, Mechanic Steve turns his attention to Maggie's steering rack, which during the teardown of the front suspension and steering assemblies looked like it was leaking oil and is in need of some tender loving care. So tune in and find out how Mechanic Steve refurbishes Maggie's steering rack. Until then, from Maggie and I, happy motoring. Hey, for those of you looking for episode outtakes, there simply aren't any. I'm happy to report that other than rinsing the degreaser from my eyes, I perform my role as an auto mechanic and an actor flawlessly. Make sure you check back on future episodes, because I'm sure there are bound to be many.